I rushed into the treatment room after hearing my husband was brought in. The doctors, nurses, and my husband all looked at me. There was a moment of silence, but when I saw my husband's face, I knew he was safe and not in any immediate danger. But the next moment shocked me. My name is Tanya, and I'm a 30-year-old nurse. My husband, Steve, is 32 and works for the government. What drew me to him, unlike my past boyfriends, was how serious and responsible he seemed. Maybe it's because of my job as a nurse, but I've always found it easy to care for others. I enjoy helping people and making them feel supported. That's why helping out my past boyfriends, lending them money, or doing favors for them, became a regular thing for me, even when I knew I probably shouldn't. Many of my fellow nurses are the same, and we often talk about relationships, but my turning point came when I met Steve. I met him on a group blind date with other nurses. He seemed quiet and serious, a type I had never dated before. I liked him right away, and there were no other girls interested in him since they thought he was too plain. After a little push from me, we exchanged phone numbers, and soon after, I asked him out. Our relationship lasted for 3 years with no major fights or problems. It was smooth, which is rare since many relationships break up after a few months. But things went well with Steve. After 3 years, I told him, things are going well, so should we get married? He proposed, and we tied the knot. Steve didn't have much dating experience before me. His hobbies were reading and playing video games at home. He didn't go out much, but he loved talking about books and never ran out of things to discuss. Even though he wasn't an outdoorsy person, he had many online friends he gamed with. Sometimes, we would play games together while chatting online. Since we started dating, Steve began going out more, mostly because I'd suggest it. He wasn't against going out, he just didn't have anyone to do it with before. Steve's family lives about a 2-hour drive away. I don't see them much, but they seem kind. Steve is the youngest of 3 siblings, and his parents are elderly. After our wedding, we only visited them once during New Year's. We exchange gifts during the holidays, and I call them sometimes, but our schedules don't line up since I work night shifts. Steve and I go out together when we both have days off, and we share the household chores. I thought everything was fine between us. However, about 3 months ago, I started noticing something strange with Steve. One evening after I got home from work, I found him asleep on the sofa. A beer can was lying on the table. I said to my husband, "You'll catch a cold." He looked at me sleepily and rubbed his eyes. "Isn't it unusual for you to be sleeping here and drinking beer?" I asked. I was at an online drinking party with my gaming friends. I had too much fun and drank too much, he replied. I didn't fully understand his online world, but I thought as long as he was having fun, it was okay. That turned out to be a mistake. After that, similar incidents kept happening. One day, I noticed my husband's hair had changed. "What's up with your hair?" I asked. He had never dyed his hair before, but now it was styled and brown. "Is this okay for your job?" I asked, knowing that as a government employee, his workplace had strict rules. "What's wrong with it? I just thought I should enjoy dressing up while I'm still young. What do you think? Does it look good on me?" My husband had always been simple and didn't care much about his appearance, but now he was suddenly different. I didn't think the new look suited him, but I didn't know what to say. "It doesn't look bad," I said softly. A few days later, he got his ears pierced. I was confused. Was he going through a midlife crisis? I tried to ignore it at first, but finally, I couldn't stay quiet. "What's going on with you lately?" I asked him directly. "Nothing," he replied, and then he went to the bedroom without saying more. I knew something was wrong, but I was too busy with work. A nurse had recently retired, and I was filling in, leaving me with little time to focus on Steve. Around this time, Steve told me, "My dad hasn't been feeling well lately, so I'm going home for the weekend to check on him." His father was old, so I understood why Steve was concerned. I agreed, and after that, he started going away every weekend. I still tried to care for him in small ways, like cooking for him and texting during work, but he rarely responded. Just when I was thinking we needed to have a serious talk, I received a shocking phone call at work. "Tanya, the police are trying to reach you," one of my colleagues said, handing me the phone. I felt a wave of anxiety. "Why are the police calling me?" I asked, picking up the phone. The officer explained that Steve had been in an accident and was taken to the emergency room. "What? Is my husband okay?" I asked in a panic. The officer assured me that it wasn't life-threatening and that Steve had been taken to the hospital where I worked. I rushed to the emergency ward, asking the nurses where he was. When I found the treatment room and opened the door, everyone inside stared at me. "Excuse me, I heard my husband was brought in," I said. The doctor looked confused, and the nurse glanced nervously at me. I felt uneasy, but when my eyes met my husband's, I was relieved. The nurse quickly explained that Steve had a serious leg injury, and they had to cut his pants off to treat him. When I looked at him again, his pants had already been removed. Suddenly, Steve noticed me looking and shouted, "Tanya, don't look at me." I was confused. As a nurse, I wondered if he was embarrassed for me to see him like this, but in the medical field, it's common to cut clothing when there's a severe injury, so it didn't seem like a big deal. "Just get out of here," my husband yelled, but I didn't understand why he was acting this way. The doctors and nurses continued working quickly to treat him, ignoring his outburst, which was only natural. They couldn't afford to stop. Then, something strange caught my attention. "What is that?" I muttered to myself. On the inside of my husband's right thigh, there was a tattoo. His injury was on his left leg, but the tattoo was on his right. The tattoo had a woman's name written on it, Yasmin. Shocked, I asked, "Who is Yasmin?" Steve looked panicked, but I left the room to let the medical team finish treating him. Later, I spoke with a nurse who told me that Steve hadn't been brought to the hospital alone. He was with a woman around his age, and the nurse assumed they were a couple. When I asked the woman's name, she said it was Yasmin, the same name on my husband's tattoo. I couldn't believe it. Was my husband having an affair? My coworker described Yasmin as having brown hair, pierced ears, and, shockingly, a tattoo of my husband's name on her thigh. It was clear now, they were having an affair. But what kind of person tattoos their lover's name on their body? I thought to myself that this woman must be unstable. As I processed all of this, I remembered the call from the police. They had first tried to reach Steve's parents, but since they couldn't drive, they gave the police my contact information. This meant Steve's parents were likely worried, so I called my father-in-law. "Is Steve going to be okay?" my father-in-law asked, clearly concerned. I reassured him, saying Steve had been in an accident but wasn't in any life-threatening danger. Hearing this, my father-in-law sounded relieved. I then asked, "By the way, Dad, are you feeling better?" My father-in-law was confused. He had no idea what I was talking about. I explained, "Steve said you weren't feeling well, and that's why he's been going to take care of you every weekend." My father-in-law was shocked. "I've been perfectly fine," he said. It was then that I realized Steve had been lying to me all along. My father-in-law was in good health, so where had my husband been going every weekend? If Steve wasn't going to his parents' house, then he must have been going to meet the woman he was having an affair with, but I had no proof. After my shift, I went home without visiting Steve, who was staying in the hospital for treatment. Once I was home, I searched through his belongings. The evidence was easy to find: photos of him with the woman, hotel receipts, and even an email confirming a reservation at a romantic resort. It was clear that they had their accident on the way back from the resort. The crash happened on a mountain road, but thankfully no one else was hurt. Steve and Yasmin weren't in life-threatening condition, but Steve's leg injury would make walking difficult for a while. Normally, I should have been worried about my husband's condition as his wife, but I didn't feel that way anymore. I couldn't believe he had lied about visiting his parents and instead used that excuse to cover up his affair. I wondered if his sudden changes, like dyeing his hair and getting his ears pierced, were influenced by this woman. I spoke to a nurse I trusted and asked her to refer me to a good divorce lawyer. The next day, I went to the hospital to drop off Steve's belongings. He seemed confused, like he couldn't remember what had happened the previous day in the treatment room. But honestly, I didn't care anymore. I left without talking to him because I had to start my shift. After work, I met with the lawyer and explained everything. He told me that with all the evidence I had, I could easily file for divorce. All I wanted was to get divorced as quickly as possible. I couldn't imagine living with him again after the betrayal. My anger was much stronger than any sadness I felt. I found a new place to live and moved out, leaving only Steve's belongings behind in the house. I decided to wait until he was discharged from the hospital before finalizing the divorce. I didn't want any issues since he was in the hospital where I worked. When the day came, I went to pick Steve up from the hospital. On the way, I told him we needed to make a quick stop. He looked confused, but agreed. I took him to a family restaurant near our house, where my lawyer was already waiting. Steve seemed puzzled and tired from standing on his injured leg, so he sat down quietly. I handed him the divorce papers. "Divorce? Why?" Steve shouted, sounding shocked. I stared at him angrily for a moment. "What do you mean, why?" You had an affair. You even had your accident during your romantic trip. I found all the evidence at home. And you lied about your father being sick just to see this woman. Steve's face turned pale. Do you think I'm naive? I continued. Yasmin, the woman you cheated with, is already out of the hospital. Her injuries weren't as bad as yours. I can't believe she was brought to the same hospital where I work. I smiled bitterly, and Steve looked even paler. You will pay for the pain you've caused me, I said, pushing the divorce papers and a pen toward him. He didn't pick up the pen. Is it just your leg that's injured, or have you lost the use of your hand too? I said sarcastically. He finally picked up the pen but wouldn't sign. He just stared at the papers. Why don't you sign? Are you afraid of starting over? Do you think this was just a game? I pressed him. He froze, as if I had hit a nerve. I glared at him coldly. You're kidding, right? I can't stay with a man who has his mistress's name tattooed on his body, I said. Steve looked at me, shocked. What are you talking about? He stammered. Maybe he was trying to play dumb, but I wasn't falling for it anymore. You really don't remember? I asked Steve. I was there when you were rushed to the emergency room. You were yelling at me not to look. Suddenly, Steve's face changed. Sound familiar? I saw the tattoo on your thigh, the one with Yasmin's name. What kind of man tattoos his mistress's name on his body? Steve was stunned, speechless. No, it's not what you think, he mumbled. I just sighed. My husband, with his dyed hair, pierced ears, and now a tattoo of the woman he cheated on me with. It was too much. If you wanted to be with her, you should have waited until after the divorce, I told him. While Steve was still in the hospital, I actually met Yasmin. It wasn't planned. We just bumped into each other. She was lost, looking for the gift shop, and asked me for directions. I pointed her to the shop and said, "Oh, and you're Yasmin, right? My husband is Steve." Her face went pale, and she hurried away, way faster than someone who was supposedly injured. I couldn't help but call after her, "Please don't run in the hospital." It was clear she was more embarrassed than I was. She probably knew I worked here, but never expected to bump into me like that. Later, I asked Steve if Yasmin had dumped him. He hadn't expected me to find out about the affair and seemed desperate to stay married, thinking he could avoid paying alimony. I couldn't believe he thought he wouldn't get caught with her name tattooed on his body. Nurses have a knack for attracting the wrong guys. I guess, when I married Steve, I thought he was different, serious, loyal, but getting a tattoo of the woman he cheated on me with, that was just the worst. I decided to leave everything to the lawyers. I had already moved out, so I told Steve he'd have to find his own way home from the hospital. Goodbye, I said, leaving him there looking pitiful, his mouth hanging open. He'd be stuck with a leg injury for a while, but honestly, he deserved it. The divorce went smoothly. I even got alimony, which left Steve broke and bankrupt. Not only that, but he also found out Yasmin was married to one of his colleagues at work. To make things even more awkward, her husband was one of Steve's online gaming buddies. Her husband filed for alimony too, and Steve had to quit his job as the scandal spread. I didn't care about the rumors or whether Steve kept his job. After the divorce was finalized, Steve's parents reached out to me, furious at what happened. When I explained everything, they apologized and promised to never let Steve hurt me again. Word got around among my coworkers, and they all laughed about it. Now, I laugh about it too. I live alone now, free to do whatever I want, and I'm happier than ever.